What if the iconic 1893 Chicago World's Fair wasn't a triumph of human progress, but the final act of a massive historical cover-up? Official history claims the dazzling White City was built from nothing in just 2 years, then conveniently destroyed. But something far stranger is that these grand buildings already existed, remnants of a lost global civilization called Tartaria, and the fair was staged to explain and to erase them. In this exploration, we won't just repeat the claims. We'll confront them with real documents, photographs, and hard evidence, and uncover why this story grips the modern imagination, secret history or irresistible myth. Close your eyes and step into the spring of 1893. After years of smoke, clamour, and sawdust, the gates of Chicago's Jackson Park swing open, and the world freezes in disbelief. Before them stands a vision so radiant, so impossibly white, it feels unreal. They call it the White City. This was no ordinary fair. Rising from swampy ground along Lake Michigan, it was a breathtaking rebuke to the ashes of the Great Chicago Fire just decades earlier. More than 200 monumental buildings stretched across the horizon, unified in a grand classical style. Towering domes, endless colonnades, perfect symmetry, reflected in calm, man-made lagoons. Electric boats drifted silently through the water. At night, millions of light bulbs banished darkness itself. Every surface gleamed alabaster white, a deliberate symbol of order, purity, and a radiant future. At the city's heart loomed George Ferris's wheel, a 264-foot steel giant that lifted visitors above this temporary Olympus. This was a city built not for trade, but for awe. Officially, it marked 400 years since Columbus and proclaimed America's arrival as a modern power, refined, electrified, and unstoppable. And the senses, oh, the senses, the scent of wet plaster and fresh lumber still drying on the facades, exotic spices and roasting coffee drifting from the midway, the sharp tang of ozone from pioneering electrical systems, the low roar of hundreds of thousands of voices speaking a dozen languages, brass bands playing Sousa marches, machinery thundering in demonstration halls, a living universe summoned from nothing. The official story calls this a triumph of human will, a perfect city raised from marshland in just 2.5 years, intentionally built to vanish. Its plaster and hemp facades whispered impermanence. Its beauty was meant to be fleeting, a glorious phantom. But step back and the story begins to crack. First, the timeline. Could a city of this scale and precision, complete with roads, canals, sewage, and a cutting-edge electrical grid, really be built in 24 months using horse-drawn carts and hand tools? Today, a single major terminal can take longer. The speed feels almost superhuman. Second, the architecture, the overwhelming classical unity, the colossal domes, ornate cornices, and ancient symmetry. This was not a collection of exhibition halls. It looked like a fully realized civic capital, rooted, authoritative, timeless. It felt older than America itself. And finally, the most unsettling question: why destroy it? If this was the crown jewel of American progress, why erase it? Photographs show solidity and craftsmanship, not flimsy stage sets. To build such perfection while planning its annihilation feels wasteful, almost deliberate, like drawing a curtain before anyone looks too closely. These three mysteries, impossible speed, ancient grandeur, and planned destruction, open a crack in the narrative, and through that crack, a far more provocative idea emerges. What if the White City wasn't built in 1891, but merely opened in 1893? This is where we enter the shadow history, legend of Tartaria. Not the cautious Tartary of textbooks, but a reimagined global civilization said to have spanned continents, united by a shared architectural language of domes, arches, and spires. Proponents point to old maps labelled Tartaria, and to grand 18th and 19th century buildings worldwide that seem too advanced, too unified, to belong to isolated cultures. According to this theory, Tartaria possessed lost technologies, perhaps even free energy, and built cities of staggering resilience. Then came a reset, a cataclysm, a mud flood, or a deliberate 19th century erasure. History was rewritten, cities were repurposed, origins were forgotten. In this telling, the Chicago World's Fair takes on a darker role. The White City was not constructed, it was discovered. A pre-existing Tartarian city centre on Lake Michigan's shore. The fair became the perfect cover story. Invite the world, claim authorship, then quietly dismantle the evidence. The demolition wasn't the end of a temporary dream. It was the final act of a cover-up. And so the White City transforms from triumph to elegy. Its rise and fall feel less like logistics and more like ritual. A postcard becomes a cipher. A marvel becomes a question mark. Is this the key to a hidden past, or a seductive myth born from our hunger for wonder? That is the mystery still glowing beneath the white plaster and vanished domes. To find real answers, we have to leave speculation behind and enter the archive. Because the claim of a pre-existing city isn't just a disagreement, it's a testable hypothesis, and the paper trail surrounding the Chicago World's Fair is not vague or circumstantial. It is vast, meticulous, and devastating to the mystery. Start with bureaucracy. We have thousands of original blueprints, not for renovated palaces, but for buildings designed from scratch. We have construction contracts with the George A. Fuller Company, hired specifically to erect them. We have payroll records listing over 10,000 workers, carpenters, plasterers, ironworkers, paid weekly to build the fair. This is not the paperwork of a cover-up, it's the paper trail of creation. Then there are the photographs. Not the iconic finished images, but sequential construction photos taken week after week. They show Jackson Park as empty, muddy shoreline, then skeletal wooden frames rise, then lath, plaster, ornament. Workers balance on scaffolding, sculpting classical details by hand. Temporary rail lines snake into the park to deliver materials. Frame by frame, the theory of a pre-existing city collapses. These buildings are not being uncovered. They are being built. The architecture itself admits the truth. Contemporary accounts from Daniel Burnham and other architects describe staff, a mix of plaster and fibre, sprayed over wood and iron frames. It was cheap, fast, lightweight, and easily moulded into the illusion of stone. It was also fragile. Newspapers of the time report facades crumbling in heavy rain and constant repairs during the fair itself. These were not indestructible monuments. They were magnificent stage sets, and everyone involved knew it. The timeline confirms it. The site dedication occurred in October 1892. The fair opened in May 1893. That left essentially one frantic construction season. The achievement wasn't supernatural. It was organisational. Massive labour forces, standardised designs, round-the-clock work, and a full embrace of temporary materials made the impossible merely exhausting. The demolition, too, was no secret. The fair sat on public parkland, under a temporary lease. From the beginning, it was understood the buildings would go. When a major fire swept through the abandoned structures, in 1894, newspapers didn't whisper conspiracy. They reported a predictable tragedy in a dry, empty plaster city. The evidence is blunt. We see the land empty, we watch the city rise, we watch it decay, and then we watch it vanish. So, the how is settled. The buildings were undeniably new. But the deeper question remains, why does the Tartarian theory feel so compelling anyway? Why build something so glorious and yet so flimsy? The answer lies in 1893 itself. The temporary nature of the White City wasn't a flaw, it was the point. First, cost. Constructing over 200 permanent stone and steel buildings at that scale would have been financially impossible. Even the wealth of the Gilded Age had limits. Staff was the miracle solution. Cheap, fast, and capable of mimicking imperial grandeur at a fraction of the price. The fair wasn't meant to be a city, it was meant to be the most spectacular stage the world had ever seen. Second, style. The Beaux-Arts classical aesthetic wasn't chosen because it was ancient or mysterious, it was chosen because it was the global visual language of power, order, and legitimacy. Daniel Burnham wanted a single, unified message. Modern or eclectic styles wouldn't have delivered instant authority. The White City was meant to look eternal precisely to show that modern America had inherited that legacy. And the demolition? It was never hidden. The lease expired. The buildings were deteriorating. They were a fire hazard. Tearing them down wasn't a purge. It was routine. World's fairs did this constantly. London's Crystal Palace was moved. St. Louis's fair buildings were destroyed. Chicago followed the rule, not the exception. When viewed this way, the logic flips. The conspiracy demands belief in a vast, flawless, global cover-up. History offers something far simpler and far more human. Ambitious men, limited budgets, brutal deadlines, and ruthless practicality, all in service of prestige and profit. The real magic wasn't hiding an ancient city. It was convincing 27 million visitors they were standing inside one. That brings us to the final piece, Tartaria itself. Historically, Tartary, or Tatary, was not an empire. It was a map label, a vague European term for the poorly charted interior of Eurasia stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. It described regions inhabited by various nomadic peoples, not a unified civilization. As Russian expansion and better cartography filled in the blanks, the label quietly disappeared. There is no archival evidence, no records, no bureaucracy, no correspondence of a globe-spanning Tartarian superempire. So how did a fuzzy map term become a lost civilization? The modern Tartarian empire theory is a digital age mythology. It began forming in the late 2000s and early 2010s on platforms like YouTube, Facebook and Reddit, spaces where mystery thrives and algorithms reward grand connective narratives. Old maps labelled Tartary were paired with photographs of ornate 19th century buildings across the world. A single seductive question tied them together. What if it was all one civilization? The theory offers a sweeping answer to complex history. It reframes industrial wealth, empire and labour into remnants of something stolen and erased. Its power lies in its simplicity. It replaces messy reality with one elegant secret. So when a grand old building is labelled Tartarian online, you're not seeing evidence of a lost empire. You're seeing a relic of our own era, a modern folklore born from distrust, nostalgia, and a hunger for hidden meaning. Which leads to the final question, perhaps the most important of all. Why does this story resonate so strongly now? That is where the real mystery lives. To truly understand why an idea like the Tartarian Empire takes hold, we have to look beyond buildings and documents and into something deeper, human longing. Official history, for all its rigour, can feel like a museum, everything labelled, preserved, and safely behind glass. It tells us what happened and when, but it often struggles to deliver the emotional why, the awe, the loss, the sense that something extraordinary once existed and slipped away. This is the space where alternative histories thrive. They don't just recount events, they offer epic meaning. Mundane processes, city budgets, planning committees, construction schedules are transformed into global conspiracies and secret erasures. A demolished building is no longer a casualty of time or policy, it becomes evidence, a clue. And most importantly, the viewer is no longer passive. You become the awakened observer, the one who sees through the illusion everyone else accepts. At its core, that impulse isn't foolish or dangerous, it's human. Asking, how did they really build this, is the same curiosity that drives real archaeology and historical research. Skepticism, when grounded, is a virtue. Where theories like Tartaria diverge is not in their questions, but in their answers. Real history is messy, fragmented, and often unsatisfying. Conspiracy narratives replace that complexity with something cleaner and more emotionally rewarding. A single hidden cause, a single lost world, a single villain. In doing so, they re-enchant a modern world that feels over-explained. The Tartaria story whispers that the past was not just different, but greater, that today we live among the ruins of forgotten brilliance. Its persistence tells us less about the 19th century than about the anxieties of the 21st, our hunger for wonder, our distrust of institutions, and our longing for deeper patterns in a fragmented world. This longing is reinforced by what we might call the aesthetic of mystery. The theory works by isolating grand buildings from their context and presenting them as anomalies. A domed courthouse, a vast railway terminal, an ornate university hall. Each is framed as a puzzle that shouldn't exist in a young nation or industrializing a city. The implication is seductive. The technology must have been inherited, not invented. But this selective framing strips away the building's real histories. The architects, the engineering journals, the civic pride, the economic motives, all vanish. The structure becomes an orphan, ready to be adopted into a more dramatic lineage, the lost Tartarian Empire. When context is restored, a different and equally fascinating picture appears. The late 19th century was not an era of architectural scarcity. It was an age of explosive confidence. The Gilded Age and Belle Epoque saw newly wealthy industrialists and ambitious governments using architecture as a declaration of power and permanence. They deliberately looked backward, reviving Renaissance, Roman, Gothic, and Baroque styles to place themselves within a grand historical tradition. Crucially, they paired old forms with new technology. Structural steel, mass-produced glass, industrial logistics, these allowed classical styles to be built faster and larger than ever before. What looks like a mysterious global uniformity is, in reality, the international fashion of power at that moment in history. Beaux-Arts classicism and revivalist grandeur. The Tartaria theory reinterprets this shared artistic language as proof of a hidden origin. That reinterpretation is powerful because it feels like cracking a secret code. A city walk becomes a treasure hunt. A carved cornice becomes lost knowledge. A vast interior space becomes forgotten science. The world feels enchanted again, but at the cost of erasing the real human stories of ambition, excess, ingenuity, and failure. So where does this leave us? Historically, the conclusion is clear. The 1893 White City was not a pre-existing Tartarian metropolis. It was a deliberate illusion. An astonishing feat of temporary artistry, labour, and organisation documented at every stage of its brief life. Its demolition was not a cover-up, but the planned final act. The Tartarian Empire, as imagined online, finds no footing in the archives of our world. And yet stopping there misses the point. Because the power of this story, its emotional pull, its viral spread, is itself a historical fact of our time. We are left with two parallel narratives. One explains what happened: plaster, ambition, spectacle, decay. The other explains what we yearn for: lost greatness, hidden truths, and a world that still holds secrets. In that sense, the Tartaria theory is a form of modern myth-making. It uses real artifacts, maps, buildings, photographs, and assembles them into a legend that speaks directly to contemporary fears and desires. It reveals our discomfort with a fully explained world and our craving for something grander and more mysterious. Which leads to the final, hardest question: what is the value of such myths? Are they harmless thought experiments that spark curiosity and reawaken wonder? Or are they corrosive, replacing evidence with emotionally satisfying fiction and training us to dismiss any contradiction as part of the cover-up? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. The real challenge is learning to hold both impulses at once, to embrace wonder and curiosity, while still honouring the complex human truth of how our world was actually built.